Welcome back, everybody, to Cheddar. An Oklahoma judge ruling against Johnson & Johnson in a landmark case on Monday afternoon. The judge ordering the company to pay the state over $500 million for its role in fueling the opioid crisis. This makes Johnson & Johnson the first drug maker to be held accountable for its role in the epidemic. Now, the state had sought more than $17 billion from the company, alleging that its sales practices created an oversupply of addictive painkillers. Joining us now is William Soliman, the executive chair at the Accreditation Council for Medical Affairs. William, great to have you here with us today.
Thanks for having me. Thanks.
Let's talk about the message that this lawsuit, now this judgment and ruling, sends across the board to the pharmaceutical industry at large.
Yeah, so this sends a really big message, right? This is basically a huge landmark for the pharmaceutical industry in the sense that today we really realize that a lot of the practices of the pharmaceutical industry from a marketing perspective are being scrutinized. And I think from my perspective, really are on the cusp of a new era in the industry.
Why are we just now learning that?
You know, it goes back. If you go back 15, 20 years, a lot of the practices in the industry were not really regulated very well. And so I think today we're seeing a lot of those effects. And so the opioid crisis is just really, you know, kind of at the top level, probably has the biggest impact on what's happened in the industry. But the reality really is that we need to think about what we do moving forward, right? If I'm a pharma CEO, I need to think about what do I do from today forward? And this is really a message, I think, to other pharma CEOs about looking at their own processes internally and regulations and what they can do to maybe try to curb some of this.
A lot of people who have spent time in doctors' offices or have family members know that a lot of times they like the friendly pharmaceutical rep bringing them lunch or
Right.
bringing, you know, the whole clinic some treats or something. It's part of the process. I think that's part of the conviction here by this judge is that having a relationship like that and making doctors or persuading them in that way is not the right way to go,
Yeah.
right? And if you look at in Oklahoma specifically, I think the Attorney General is saying something like, 18 million scripts were written in a 5-year period when the overall population is 3 million. I mean, when you at the association and your group look at this, was there a bit of self-reflection then in the practices?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. The thing is, right, and this is why I really believe in what the Accreditation Council for Medical Affairs does, we really need to set standards, right, and certify and train people who are out talking to physicians. And actually, pharma reps only have on average about 30 seconds with a doctor. If you look carefully at what the state claims against Johnson & Johnson, it's really about campaigns that were non-promotional. Who drives non-promotional campaigns? It's not really the pharma sales reps. That's on the promotional side. It's really people that are on the medical side. And so what we do is really certify and train those medical people. Those people are the people that are actually getting the time with the physicians, that are actually educating the physicians. So we need to look at that moving forward because more and more pharma is relying on those people to educate the physicians, not necessarily the reps.
How does this impact the trust of the end consumer who the doctors are ultimately talking, having those conversations with and making these recommendations, that non-promotional conversation that they might be having?
Right. Look, it causes a loss in trust, right, and credibility, ultimately within the medical community. And I think the industry now needs to think about what they do moving forward. I think education, training, certification is really the way to move forward to make sure that we have uniform standards across the industry. Think about what happened at Insys Therapeutics, right? Insys Therapeutics not long ago, the charges of racketeering, et cetera. If we had had some kind of accreditation in place, that might have been prevented from happening at Insys Therapeutics.
I misspoke. I said 5-year period, 18 million. It was actually just a 3-year, 4-year period of 2015 to 2018, the 18 million. Scripts. I want to get your reaction on news that developed this afternoon, according to NBC News, breaking the story that Purdue Pharma and its owners, the Sackler family, offering to settle the more than 2,000 lawsuits against the company for $10 billion to $12 billion. This in contrast with what we just saw with the J&J case. How do you evaluate the outcomes?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Purdue had a major impact on the prescription of OxyContin and opioids in the country, right? I think, again, it sends the message that pharma is paying attention now. They're listening, right? They know that there's a lot more scrutiny on what they're doing. And I think this might be really the impetus that we need to change things and move it in the right direction and maybe raise the bar in the industry, right? Thinking about what we need to do moving forward to maybe establish a little bit more regulations around the people that are working and talking to those doctors. what kind of certification and credential do they really have.
Given that you have back-to-back days where two big companies like this are being either targeted or investigated, or finally some type of research end to the research is coming out and it concludes in a fine in one way or the other, you know, for these companies, not only is it back to the drawing board on the research, but it's also back to the drawing board on, okay, the products that are going out into the market, where do you need to pull back? How does this impact revenues? Investors seeing J&J move higher here on the day,
right,
off of relief that it wasn't as bad as it could have been with that $17 billion.
Right.
And so what is next for some of these companies when they walk back into their meeting rooms? Where do they start back up again in rebuilding trust, but also, again, trying to figure out, all right, how do we rebuild the business model?
Yeah, I mean, look, for J&J, you know, they have cash on hand, $17 billion, right, in cash. For them, $572 million, it's not going to impact them as much, but it's a warning sign. I think it's a warning sign to the other pharma CEOs, to the industry at large, that we need to think about how we change things moving forward, what our processes look like moving forward, and what we need to do to make sure that this type of debacle doesn't occur. I mean, and just recently, the alleged situation with Novartis Avexis, another, you know, major issue, which really, you know, is quite embarrassing for Avexis, right? In the sense that they weren't really sure of the data they were putting out, and it really was incredible data. That's a concern for a lot of patients.
Can you give us some insight into how the pharmaceutical companies actually educate your members so that they then educate doctors? I mean, have they been transparent in the past about the effects of opioids?
Yeah, so look, I think, you know, the pharmaceutical industry definitely plays one role, right, in this opioid crisis. They're not the end-all, be-all. I think, you know, from our perspective at the Accreditation Council for Medical Affairs, in terms of how we interact with the pharmaceutical industry, we're really trying to tell them, look, let's raise the bar, right? Let's try to, you know, educate and certify your folks so that there's uniform standards across the industry.
Yeah, I guess what I'm asking is about the education itself. What was being taught about these drugs?
Really, it was a lot of high level, I would say surface level understanding of just the basic indication of the drug, not really getting into maybe some of the deleterious or negative consequences of opioids. And I think that's where, you know, there's a lot of concern about what these reps were being taught and what they were being asked to educate physicians.
Yeah, I guess it's just, I mean, it's just, you know, I mean, these pharmacists, I mean, they have deep training on how chemicals affect the body. It just seems also a little bizarre that this is so new, that nobody up and down the chain of handing these drugs out could have not foreseen this.
Yeah, it's really crazy when you think about it. But I think, you know, myself working in the industry for 15 years, what I can tell you is when you work in the industry, they want you to have a take on the data, right? And they want you to present that data in a particular way. And that's something I think we need to look at. How can we objectively present the data in a way that really is going to help the clinician make the best decision for patients?
Okay, I want to come back to the data in a second, but for the companies that are now seeing families as well go after them for damages, what do you think these companies can do to make sure that they are righting a significant wrong, their contribution to the opioid crisis? How can they help with some of these families that have been impacted as a result?
Yeah, I think you bring up a really good point. You know, with Purdue, for example, they're trying to set up this trust.
Yeah.
I think that can help. I think trying to help set up maybe addiction treatment centers, right? Helping these families be able to cope on a day-to-day basis with some of the ramifications of addiction and opioid crisis, trying to get out into the communities and maybe warn youngsters about the deleterious effects of opioids in general, right? Because it starts young if you look, right? So I think that's where pharma can play a role in educating the community and helping them really understand maybe what some of the negative consequences could be.
And then, if you could, just coming back to the data, can you break that down a little bit more? Because specifically, what data is looked at when it comes to making some of these recommendations? And then from a tech company's perspective, they're saying, how can we get more involved with the data, especially as it pertains to healthcare? I mean, you've got Amazon, a company that just purchased PillPack, which is going to arguably have a role in the direct-to-consumer or direct working with some of these Medicare providers to dispense some of the pills that are prescription-based as well. Where does the overlap come down to at the end of the day? Where could they potentially we could potentially see tech more involved in this conversation?
Yeah. I think really it comes down to looking at population health data once the drug has been marketed, looking at some of that outcomes data, and really trying to understand what's the utility usage of these drugs. Also trying to understand the cost effectiveness of these drugs in terms of their health economic outcomes perspective, and really trying to get a better gauge as to which populations are really the populations that are going to most benefit from these drugs. And also, there's a lot more developed now from a pharmacogenomics perspective in the sense that we're able to identify which patients are most likely to respond to those drugs and which patients are less likely to be addicted to those drugs. And that's where I think tech can play a really important role.
All right, we got to leave things there. William Soliman, Executive Chair at the Accreditation Council for Medical Affairs, joining us here today.
Thank you very much for having me.